Welcome to the podcast. I'm Ula, part of the Heart and Bones team where I support content and strategy. I'm also a yoga teacher and a hypermobile person myself. So today's topic is one that's really close to home, hypermobility. I'm really excited to sit down with Brea Johnson, founder of Heart and Bones Yoga, an anatomy nerd, and a longtime champion of sustainable movement, to explore what hypermobility really is, and more importantly, how to move in ways that feel strong, stable, and supported, whether you're hypermobile or not. We'll unpack strength versus stretch, nervous system regulation, and how to teach without accidentally glorifying deep flexibility. But before we get started, just two quick things. If you're curious about yoga teacher training that is anatomy informed and supports hypermobility, our 200-hour and 300-hour programs are open for fall enrollment. They're thoughtful, anatomy informed, and designed to support your growth as a teacher, not just add more content to memorize. The best part, it's all online and fully accessible wherever you are with a global cohort to learn alongside. You'll find the link in the show notes. If you want to try classes that support hypermobility, come join us online at Heart and Bones Studio. This month, you can try it out all for $1. That's full access to classes, programs, and playlists, including a hypermobility playlist. Everything inside the studio for just $1. It's a great way to start or restart a consistent, sustainable practice, and also amazing for teachers as well. So again, that'll be in the description. Okay, Brea, let's get into it. I want to start with the basics. What is hypermobility and why does it matter in a yoga context?
Well, hypermobility, we can think of it as a spectrum. So hypermobility is really when a joint is able to move beyond its normal range of motion. But what is a normal range of motion? That's going to be different for everybody. So when we're talking about here in this context, hypermobility is, like those, and I think those who know who they're hypermobile will know. And whether that's the spectrum of hypermobility disorders, or you've just got some joints that can move quite beyond that normal range. That's what we're looking at today, of like, how do we look at hypermobility and how do we basically support our joints so that we move in ways that what I like to think of is like a hug for your joints, so that we're not going beyond those ranges, so that we actually can have proprioception improved, joint stability, joint strength improved. So that's my view of hypermobility. So again, just a little quick disclaimer, if somebody does have a hypermobility disorder like EDS, then I would definitely talk to your healthcare practitioner first. This is all just more information in this podcast for the general public. But that's why when we talk about hypermobility, it's kind of like a spectrum. And when some of us might be on different moments of that spectrum. It's interesting because I think, having been practicing yoga since 1998, I have been in this yoga world for a very long time, where there's been, and so I'm hoping that it's a little bit different now, but I think predominantly over these past 2 or so decades is seeing that there's always been this reward and goal and drive towards flexibility, which really in a lot of ways has shown up as hypermobility. So I think that's actually really interesting that you had a yoga teacher who saw your hypermobility for what it was, rather than praising you and going, "Oh, Ula, look how deep you are in that pose. Look, hooray, you're so good at yoga." Because you can, because you have these joints and muscles that allow this really extreme range. And I think that has been the norm. I also think that I live in a maybe yoga bubble where I look around my little yoga world and go, okay, good. More and more people aren't celebrating the hypermobility, the hyperflexibility, and yay, we're doing stuff that's the opposite. But I also know that I think it's still kind of common.
Yeah, I actually have been reading more and more into hypermobility. Just out of curiosity for myself. And one thing that I thought was so interesting is when we're praising hypermobility, or perhaps not realizing we're praising hypermobility, the damage someone might be doing to their joints and to their ligaments. There's these like kind of downstream effects that we might not think about. And when we're like, oh, I just started yoga and I'm young and super flexible, just at a dance class, I feel so good. And now 20 years later, it's like, oh, now I'm starting to feel this like lifetime of not caring for myself properly. And now I'm trying to kind of rectify that and go back to like a more sustainable practice. But I do think that there is this kind of myth that flexibility is better versus strength and stability. And I know inside the studio for the month, we're going to be really focusing on stability. And it's interesting because if someone isn't hypermobile, it doesn't mean you shouldn't work on your stability,
Oh,
right?
yeah. And well, so let's break it down here a little bit. So, one of the things with hypermobility, there's two things that come to my mind. It's like hypermobility and stretchy sensation. And we, first and foremost, I think in the yoga world, and probably in a lot of stretching cases. So, when we're talking about, of course, we all know yoga is so much more than movement and stretching. But in this context, we're talking about the physical side of asana where we go to stretchy feeling. That's what I call it there. That is absolutely not a scientific term, obviously. I don't think there's scientific studies on stretchy feeling. But what I call stretchy feeling is when we do a forward bend, when we do any sort of, I'm just going to use a hamstring stretch, and you stretch until you feel the stretchy feeling. So for those of us who aren't as mobile, we probably don't have to move as far to feel stretchy feeling. Those who are more mobile, heading towards the hypermobile end of the spectrum, you have to go way further to find any sensation. And quite often, you won't even have stretchy feeling. Or by the time you get to stretchy feeling, you're like, head is through your legs, right? And does your head need to go there? No. And so we have been trained in yoga historically in the modern world. When I say historic, it's like in the last couple decades, to find the stretchy sensation, which, as you've mentioned, is a disservice for those with hypermobility, because what's happening in the body with hypermobility and around the joint, you have less proprioception, which means you'll have less awareness of what a boundary is. Because what we're looking for with stretchy sensation is a boundary, really. That's your body signal going, hey, I should stop here. And a hypermobile person may go, I don't stop where? Like my leg can go anywhere it wants. Like it's all. And so you don't know what that boundary is because you're not as clear in those sensations. And so that word stability is so vital, because what we're trying to do is actually create stability, is creating boundaries in our movements so that we can embody the mind body, the proprioception, your nervous system can understand the signals that your body's saying, that like, oh no, this is far enough in my joint, I don't have to go further. And then that often opens up a bigger can of worms, because if we've been people that have been celebrated, as you said, you came from dance, so a lot of dancers, of course, and then you go to yoga and you're like, oh, celebrated even more for your flexibility. And if you're doing that kind of traditional stretchy feeling type of yoga, you're not cultivating that ability to understand what these boundaries, your movement joint boundaries, are. So doing stability work is really important. So this is my caveat, if you have been celebrated or used to not having to work too hard, you said the words earlier, like hanging out in your joints, and now all of a sudden you've got this teacher or an approach to yoga that's asking you to work differently, it's not going to be as fun at first. In my experience with teachers and teacher trainings, when we bring in this approach, and I definitely have had people who weren't ready. So again, there's like a couple of times I'm thinking of in some teacher trainings over the years, where some of the people who were used to being super flexible and being the most flexible person in the room were doing a standing forward bend, and your head and your arms are like wrapped around, and it's like the cover of the yoga journal, and everybody's like, oh my God, look at you. And then when we try to ask for this different way of doing a forward bend that's actually really consciously creating the boundary, i.e., working on engaging and activating the posterior chain, all of a sudden that person's not as flexible anymore. And I've seen the ego death of like, oh wait, and resistance to it. So I am not surprised. I'm fascinated by these deeper stories of, again, around our rewards for being flexible. We've talked about this in other podcast episodes, what flexibility means in the world of like and so on and so forth. So that's kind of like a big thing to think of. So yeah, stability, but it's like this whole awareness of proprioception, and it's a beautiful yoga practice. So if the practice of yoga is about awareness, it's an awareness practice. It's so much more powerful for the hypermobile person, because then we get to bring the yoga into our joints. We get to bring the yoga into our body and build awareness and go, oh, this is where I should move. This is what my joint likes. My joint doesn't want to go further. What is that further? What is that boundary?
Yeah, as a hypermobile person, I got to avoid strength by being hypermobile. And it wasn't until I had teachers like point it out to me that I realized, oh, I actually have to like potentially engage my core if I'm in a lunge, or I have to push, not just, putting yoga blocks under my hands so I'm not touching the ground. And there's these cues that I know worked for me. Do you have any advice for teachers, or maybe even if you're a student, you can kind of think about them? Maybe cues to support someone that might be hypermobile, or the flip side is, how could we avoid praising hypermobility in a class, because that also is a whole conversation.
Yeah. Okay. I love this. I get really excited about this because, so what I always call the way that I teach is an anatomy informed approach. So anatomy informed approach to yoga means that we understand things like hypermobility. We understand what joints and muscles need for healthy, sustainable, long-term functional movement, and how that looks in real life, and how we can help support hypermobility. The thing that gets me really excited about that is that the key that works for hypermobility also works for lack of mobility. I call this approach the great equalizer, because so historically, when we're teaching again in that more classic way of like, okay, if you're able to go deeper into the pose, do this. For those who can't do that, do this. And you're actually having to, first of all, that is like ableist type of language. I don't love it. It's not the most sustainable, supportive way of teaching. And it's more complicated for you as a teacher too, because now you have to give a separate set of cues for the people who have the ability to go, quote, and when I say go deeper in a pose, that's like very in air quotes. Deeper, what the hell does that even mean? Again, another conversation to unpack. But you're giving a set of cues for those people, and then you have to go to the people who aren't as mobile and give them a whole bunch of set of cues. And meanwhile, 10 minutes have passed and nobody's in the pose because we're having to manage a lot. So when it comes to this anatomy informed approach, it's the same 99% of the times in my experience. It's the same cues for everybody, the great equalizer. And no longer are we looking at like that standing forward bend example here. And so historically, it would have been that person who's super flexible, their head's on their knees. The person who's not as flexible, they've barely done a hip hinge, right? And the range of movement is so vast between the two. But when we bring in this approach, that hypermobile person no longer has their head on their knees if they're doing it in the, I don't want to say correct, but in an effective way. And they're a little bit closer to the range of the person who's less mobile. So again, the great equalizer. So, but what is that? What are we cueing so that we're creating that equalizing effect? So that more like the cue that works for everybody. And most of the time for me, we're focusing on mobility. What is mobility? I playfully call it the love child between flexibility and stability, because mobility asks us to move in a way that is getting everything on board. Your nervous system, all the muscles around a joint, the tissues, everything working together. Flexibility is more like the range of motion that you might have around a joint, or the ability for your joints to stretch. This is PS, everybody. This is a podcast. This is the most super simplified ways of talking about this. I want to just keep it super clear and simple. There's more nerdy ways we could talk about this, but I'm just keeping it simple and real for us. Okay. So again, so where Ula had mentioned before, going like, I didn't have to use my strength to be in a pose, classic hypermobility experience. That's more flexibility. Again, I'm making this super simple here. So that's like a classic experience of flexibility. Moving towards the mobility territory, it means then that we do need a little bit of strength. We need activation. And in order to do that, we need our brain on board. You have to really think about it. You have to do certain things, which now leads us into what I call action cues. So instead of just cueing the body like right foot forward, engage your quads. First of all, what is engaging your quads? Everybody try that right now. If you're standing, if you're sitting, if you're walking, stop for a second and let's all engage our quads. Okay, so I hope we got that. And also, what does engaging our quads even mean? If you're saying that to a whole group of people, we all get it on some level, but there's a big difference between telling your body, okay, quads engage, because some people are like already living in a world where their quads are always tight. And so to them, engage the quads is like, oh, I'm really going to engage. Other people might be disconnected from their body and they're going to engage their something else more because they can't access the quads. I'm coming back to the action cues, my friends. So this is where action cues is less about this like engage your quads, squeeze your butt, those kind of cues that we typically do in a yoga practice. An action cue instead gets us to move in such a way that your quads, for example, will engage without you having to tell them. So this is a podcast. If I'm doing this in a workshop or a class, here's where we would all do it in our body. So I'll sort of walk us through as clearly as we can here verbally. So one of the action cues that we can think of is the action of pushing the floor away from you, whether that's your foot, whether that's your hand. So let's stick with the quads because that's what I was talking about. So let's pretend we're in a lunge. Hey, if you're listening to this and you're able to do a lunge, go and do it with me, or visualize if you can't. So you're in a lunge. You've got one foot forward, maybe you're in warrior one, warrior two, and you're in that knee at a 90-ish degree angle. And so when you're in that lunge, let's engage the quads. Notice how that feels. Okay, cool. Quads doing something. But now don't even worry about your quads. Feel your foot pressing into the floor, like you're pushing the floor away from you. We're going to generally feel your quads engage, but also your glutes engaged and your hamstrings. So we did an action, we cued an action, push the floor away from you to create an action in the rest of the body without having to say anything about those muscles. Because let's try that one more time. I hope, again, if we're doing this in our body with us, there's a different quality of the engagement of the quads than there is in the engagement of the action cue. So meaning, so quickly go back, feel like you're okay, everybody in that lunge, engage your quads. And then relax that and now push the floor away from you. And notice again, it's like the same, but different. And what that's doing in your joints now, so engaging the quads in a lunge helps support the hip joint and your knee joint and your ankle joint. So for the hypermobile person, that action cue, actually for everybody, because again, this is the great equalizer, that action cue becomes a game changer for how we hold and support the joints in space, how we move. We are building stability. We're bringing that neuromuscular awareness. We're bringing that proprioception, all that things together in this really simplified way that all I did as a teacher was say, push the floor away from you with your foot or with your hands on the floor in down dog or tabletop, right? So there's a lot of different types of action cues, but that's one example of how it is literally such a game changer for people that is just works for everybody, makes your life better as a teacher, way easier, and it's actually super more functional. So that was a really long answer / demonstration, but I hope that that helps start to give us a better picture of what these action cues are, what anatomy-informed yoga does for the hypermobile and not so mobile body.
You mentioned the nervous system. What role does the nervous system play in hypermobility? How does it connect to regulation, burnout, or even emotions?
That's a good bunch of questions. And I feel like for me, in my scope of practice for disclaimers, I always have to put on, because I personally, you know, as much as I teach an anatomy informed approach, I'm not a doctor, I'm not a physiotherapist. I do have a lot of experience and training, but again, this is always my disclaimers, especially when it comes to things like hypermobility, because we are starting to go into like the hypermobility spectrum, like disorder, EDS, and yeah, so I always just feel like I need to put a little caveat on those, of course, for my own sense of self. And I hope everybody's listening. Take what you can. So one of the things with the nervous system and hypermobility, it's like what I said before, is that we don't often, if you have more hypermobility in around the joints, it means typically that we have less proprioception, less of the ability to understand a boundary in the movement. So for me as a teacher, teaching average people, teaching teachers to teach as well, I really stay in the lane of looking at the nervous system as how can we build boundaries in movement? So, boundaries in movement is really huge because, as we've talked about a lot already, boundaries are not really a thing when it comes to a lot of approaches to movement and asana. It's like, how deep can you go? How far can you go? How many boundaries can we just like blow past? And it's huge to understand, especially when you have those joints that are like, oh, you want me to go over here, and they go as far as they can. It's really important to be able to rein that in and understand and know what's happening all around that joint, working with those action cues and those types of movements that inherently create a boundary without you forcing the boundary. I think this is a really beautiful nuance with this approach, is that we're not like, create a boundary, and then we're like creating stiffness and creating too much tension. The action cues give us the opportunity to create a supple boundary. So you're creating stability, but it's not, right? And you're creating support. It's like a hug for the joints rather than a restriction and cage for the joints, was another way to think about what these action cues do in our body. And that's very supportive for the nervous system. Feeling in your nervous system physically what it means to have a boundary in your movement becomes a very somatic, powerful experience when we need to bring boundaries into our relationships. Because not being boundaried is really nebulous feeling, right? Like if I don't have a boundary, like again, the hypermobile body, it's like your joints are floating in space. They don't know what they're doing and where they're going. So having that somatic, clear boundary experience is powerful. So that's for me how I focus on boundaries in movement and the nervous system, both as an opportunity to understand what it feels like to be stable, to be supported in the joint so that I can have that confidence and clarity, because it isn't our yoga practice, this practice of awareness and self. And may that practice show up in how we relate to others in really helpful and supportive ways, which also helps your nervous system.
I think on the flip side, there's, as a yoga teacher, is respecting a student boundary. And I have had injuries, and the last thing I needed is someone to come and press on me because they knew I was a hypermobile person and I could go deeper into a posture. And I've also had teachers that are very respectful of my boundaries and were able to help me through, I wouldn't even say adjustments, but through their cueing, by bringing a block over, by, touching my hand only, and giving an action cue to help me have that proprioception. That I think I agree, when you're talking about this lack of proprioception as a hypermobile person, I'm like nodding my head, because yes, sometimes it took someone walking up to me and being like, hey, by the way, did you notice your hand is over here? It doesn't have to be that far. Like, why don't you press the other way and engage that muscle, right? And so I think a teacher just has, if you are curious about hypermobility, I think this is, a student dealing slash, oh my gosh, I'm like rambling because I'm a student and a teacher. And I don't want someone just to press on me, but I do appreciate support.
What a good distinction.
As a teacher that teaches, teachers, Brie, my question: are there things that you go over in the teacher training, or you'd recommend for teachers, or anything else to just kind of give them the toolbox?
Yeah. Well, and I think, thank you for bringing up the adjustments example, because I think that's an amazing example of how also as teachers we can support boundaries. So what you already said, I think was half the answer for the question, showing, because like, hello, I think most of us have probably been there, done that, especially if we've done things like Ashtanga yoga. And, the only injury that I've really had was from Ashtanga, and somebody, because it's all that perception of, and go further, I'm going to press you down. But you're so right, contrasting that to the more functional boundary teacher who's like, okay, press into my hand, or press your hand into the floor. Or sometimes I'm thinking like half moon pose, and I'll sometimes like use my body, like the side of my body, and have their foot press into my body. So it's just like, hey, or my hand or whatever it is. And like, that's your boundary. Or what you said with the arm going back, and like the teacher actually just like, those are helpful adjustments. Those are like really, really where the teacher becomes the boundary in a supportive and curious way. Because they're like, hey, did you know your hand's over here? What if you put your hand over there? Ah, right? So it becomes this beautiful connection, not just the person have to doing all the work, but as a teacher, you're inherently supporting and respecting people's boundaries when you do that way of teaching. So that one's a huge one. Also echoing what you already said about everybody having a block. So not just like, if you need a block today, grab it. And I'm always, as a teacher, I'm like, everybody grab a block. Because again, in this anatomy informed approach, oftentimes, yes, we may use a block to prop ourselves, let's say in a low lunge. And sure, the more flexible people don't have to do that. Their hands can touch the floor on either side of the knee. But the way that I teach, I want every single person to use a block, because we're not just using that block to rest our hands on. We're often using that block as a boundary, as a part of our action cue. And I'd also know sometimes having some people in the class who are more mobile, who have always done their lunges, for example, with the hand on the ground, having them not do that, having them be just a little bit higher up changes and along with the action cue, changes the experience of the pose. And I want to kind of give them that without saying it directly, right? So it's like, because also with the hands on the block is supportive for the people who aren't as mobile. And we're back to that sense of the great equalizer. Everybody is winning in this position, in this approach. Another way that I really think a good way to bring in more proprioception and boundaries to support hypermobility in the body is also doing before and after type teaching. So what I like to do, because this is a new approach for a lot of people have maybe never been cued in these ways that we do in this. And so I might go the old way. I might be like, using the lunge example, I might be like, hey, everybody, let's go into a low lunge. Don't even use a block, whatever, and we just do it. I cue it, I let them feel, and we're all going to get stretchy feeling. And we're all like, ooh, yay, this feels great. I'm feeling stretchy feeling. And then I will do my more updated version where we're no longer looking for stretchy feeling. We're looking for activation of the hip joint, of the foot, of the knee, of the ankle, the hands, whatever we're doing in that lunge. And then I'm like, okay, do this activation. Notice how that feels. Okay, cool. Now let's go back to the other version and we'll come back. And that's what I mean by the before and after. And that is like, trust me, my friends, if you do this, you will have the buy-in from your classes, because most people need to know that before and after, because they're so familiar with doing it the same way. But when they do this other way, there's something, and this is anecdotal, but it's pretty significant. When I started to change the way that I taught and brought in this more anatomy informed approach, the change in my classes, because a lot of the times, especially in those early days, people were with me for a long time. And then I'm starting to slowly pepper this stuff into my classes. And what happened with people who went the old way that I taught, started to do it this way. And they're like, oh my God, that feels so much better. But they never would have thought didn't feel better before. They thought it felt good. So it's an interesting thing. And that's why that before and after and this approach is just so exciting, because it simplified my teaching. It worked for everybody. And especially our hypermobile bodies, they're like, oh, that's the first time I felt my hamstrings. Oh, that's what my posterior chain feels like. Right? And they didn't know they were missing it until they were getting it. So there's like this sort of nervous system affirmation when we bring this activation into our movements, moving away from that emphasis on the hypermobility.
As a hypermobile person, having teachers over time bringing in things like blocks or even pillows for shavasana, for under my knees, because my back is even hypermobile. So I was so grateful to these teachers that made it really comfortable that even as a hypermobile person, I was reaching for blocks, and now it's just like part of my practice. I think I have 20 blocks kicking around the house, one in each room at this point, because I finally reached a point where I was like, oh, shavasana can be comfortable. Because I was like hyperextending my lower back, like it was uncomfortable. I would have to bend my knees because it would hurt. So bringing in a bolster was so lovely.
And I want to even throw in, Ula, sorry to interject with that, because I think what you're saying is so great. And the word that keeps coming back to me is, it's like, because you had asked about the nervous system again, and it's like, that's nervous system support. Because again, that hypermobile person in a very simplified way is like loosey goosey, nebulous, floating around the world. Like, where am I? Like, what? Like, the boundaries aren't there. And then you get to not only feel the boundary of the movement of your joint, but within that, you're feeling support. So in Shavasana, yeah, you're like, oh, yeah, no, I feel relatively relaxed in Shavasana. But then, as you said, whoa, that's what it feels like when I have support. That's the difference between like, oh, I feel okay, to your nervous system goes involuntarily, generally, when we find the right way of support, it's like, oh, right? The nervous system will just go, oh, because that's when you found that sweet spot of support that you weren't finding in your everyday life when you're walking up and down the stairs, when you're bending down. It's like, it's a huge thing. There's a lot of layers with this. It's not just building stability. It's actually really nurturing ourselves.
For teachers that, let's say you're walking around the class, all right, and you got one of me in your class, how do you spot someone who's hypermobile? Like, are there things that a teacher kind of can look for while they're teaching a class or walking around? Are there kind of some dead giveaways? I mean, my funky elbows were always a dead giveaway.
There's a couple things with that answer. So my first sort of cheeky answer to that is I don't care, because I'm teaching in ways that inherently supports all the bodies as best as I can. Are we ever going to support all bodies all the time? No, but is in the context of the class and the people that are coming, this again, anatomy informed approach just inherently is the great equalizer. And so it doesn't matter to me if somebody's hypermobile or not. I don't care. I care, but I don't care, because I know what I'm teaching and I feel confident in the ways that I'm teaching is supporting all the movement. So that's the cheeky answer. The more also detailed answer would be, after a while, as well, if you're a teacher who's mobile and hypermobile yourself, you'll probably just recognize it very easily. For people who aren't, I'm not a hypermobile person. My elbows can be a little bit like that, overextended, but that's about it. I came into yoga at like 18, 19, very, very stiff as a person. So I've had to learn to recognize some of those things. I think the most obvious ones, of course, if you're doing that forward bend and the person's just like, wee, and like comes easily all the way down with no like struggle or effort, they're probably on that spectrum of like flexibility and mobility or hypermobility. And yeah, some of the more subtle ones would be actually when we do start to cue in ways that are inviting more activation. Some hypermobile people in some poses still won't get it. So of course I'm spending this whole podcast being like, this is going to change everybody's life, go do it, and it will. But because some hypermobile bodies have spent so much time disconnected from that proprioceptive awareness of what work is in the body around the joint. Let's go with a hamstring forward bend, standing forward bend. That one I have had absolutely, I can spot that, even though I'm going like 20 different ways to get this action happening in their posterior chain, I can tell it's not really clicking on. Also, I ask. So as a teacher, we can ask. So when I'm giving a cue, especially a new cue for a lot of people, let's say these activation cues, I'll be like, does that make sense? And most of the people are like, oh my God, that makes sense. Holy crap. Like, this just got 10 times harder. But then there might be a few people who are like, I still don't feel anything. And I'm like, okay, not surprised. Cool, cool, cool. And then I might, like, depending on the class and how much time there is and how much I really want to go into depth on this, I will add a couple more cues because I know this. I've had experience. I'm like, okay, I have a couple of other things in my back pocket that I can see if they're getting it. And let's remember, as teachers, when we give new movement patterns to people, do not expect people to get it right away, especially when we are trying to change a movement pattern that is deeply embedded in somebody's body. So the first place a movement pattern starts is in the mind body, in the head, in the nervous system. And that may not show up in the body. So you might be looking around and that hypermobile person has not changed a thing. They look just as mobile. They look like they're flopping around left, right, and center. But and you've given them 10 cues and it's still not changing anything. Please remember, teachers, to trust that the fact that they're thinking about being in their body in a different way than their unconscious habit has started the change. It may not show overtly in the body, but trust that you're getting them to even think differently about the body. And maybe if they keep coming back to your class and they keep thinking about it and care about it and want to change a little bit more, then you might start to see, and it might take a couple weeks or a couple classes for you to see a noticeable difference. But that doesn't mean they're not getting the benefits, even if it doesn't show up in their body. I hope that's a really big one for teachers to remember. So feel free to rewind and listen to that again with love, because I think we get so, and whether this is hypermobility or not, I think as teachers we're like, I need to see the visual result of my cues, like, and most often we do, and often we don't, and then we think our cue wasn't good, or we think our teaching wasn't good. Trust that you're teaching movement patterns. The mind body is being connected bit by bit and in a way that you can't see, but you got to trust that the movement's happening and the mind body connection awareness is happening. Okay, so that's kind of a long answer for that, but I think it's a very important one, especially when it comes to hypermobility. It takes time. So it might, for some people, some cues right away, yay, and then other things it might take time, and just trust that it can change.
If this whole conversation you're just like being blown away and you want to know more about hypermobility, how to care for yourself, how to care for potential students, I'm going to personally say, as a hypermobile person, it wasn't until I took teacher training that I really began to understand even my own body, how it works, and how to support my own personal practice. Like, I never went into teacher training thinking I was going to be a teacher. That ended up being a really beautiful bonus at the end of it because I built that confidence over the months of training. We have our 200-hour and 300-hour programs open for our fall enrollment. I'll leave a link in the bio so you can learn more. It's a thoughtful, anatomy focused. If you didn't pick up on that, we love anatomy, very focused on that training.
You'll learn the action cues. You'll learn all these things that I'm talking about.
Absolutely. And it's obviously designed to, support your growth as a teacher and as a student. So that will be in the description below.
And I'll also add, if you don't want to do the teacher training or a little preview of the type of like the ways and how this feels in your body. So again, that before and after that I was talking about, go join the Heart Bones online studio for $1 for a month, because we have like virtually every single class in there is going to be supportive for hypermobility, but we also have collected our really best hypermobility focused classes into an entire lovely hypermobility playlist. There's just, and I love the anecdotes from people who are like, this has changed my life. Meaning like they used to do yoga in pain until they started to do our approach. And then they're like, whoa, oh, hello body now. And I'm not like, this gets me so excited because we want to be able to have people feel good in their bodies and feel confident. So anyways, join. We're excited about it. So feel it for yourself and your body. $1 for 1 month. If you don't like it, we don't care. We care, but we don't care. Cancel at the end or keep on joining us, because it's like there's a lot of goodness with the online studio.